Okay, so let's have a think about how we're actually going to code this program. So after having done our initial design, we've got some idea of the structure, we thought about the various bits. Now let's try and look at the code to do that. So we know we need obviously a main function. We're now well versed with the fact that kind of wrap everything up in main. We also want a function that's going to go away and calculate the factorial of a number. So factorial, and we're going to ask it to work out the factorial of a particular number. So this function obviously needs, as we've shown, some input, and the argument we're going to pass in is a number I want the factorial of, and obviously our code is going to return the answer. So at the moment I'm just going to get it to return the number 5, just so you know my code will compile, my code will run and at least give me something back. We also want our function called isPrime. So remember, our function isPrime is going to check if a number is prime or not. So again, it needs an argument, it needs a number we want to check. And this really is asking a question, is this number prime? So this particular function, when we think about what it returns, is going to be returning a Boolean value, which is either true or false. Okay, so those are the basic functions. We'll come back to writing those in a bit. Let's think about our main bit of code up here. So remember what we're trying to achieve. We want to get the user to type a number in. We want to test whether that number is in fact a numeric before we do the integer conversion. And then we want to go round a loop from 2 all the way up to that number, calculating the factorial and whether it's a prime or not, and print the results. Now we could put all of this kind of input from the user off in a separate function and the loop in a separate function, and in a bigger program it might make more sense to do that. For now, just for ease, we're actually going to leave it all in main. So our main function is actually going to be doing some of the work. So first of all, we obviously need to just print to the user what's going on. So we're going to say factorial and prime checker. So we've kind of told them what's going on. You might want to explain more. And then we want to say, please enter maximum value to check. Okay, so at that point now we know we want some input, and we're going to ask them to type in the maximum value, so we'll call this the max val. That kind of makes sense, and we're going to use obviously our input command. So our input function then returns the value that the user types in. Now we know at this point what the user typed in comes in as a string value, so what we need to do now is, before we try and convert it into a number, check whether it's valid or not. So we can say if max value, so remember max value is a string. Strings have got methods. One particular method is called isDigit, and I hope I spell it right. And that particular method now will check whether the string max val is in fact a digital value. So if it is a digital value, then we want to go and run our program, obviously in here. So we've got to put our code in here. I'll come back to that in a minute. If it's not, then obviously what the user has typed in is not a digital value, so we need to tell them that they've done something wrong. So we'll say print, you did not enter a number. A few exclamation marks give them a bit of a warning. Now in reality we would loop around in our code here so that the user got a chance to at least put it in correctly. We haven't looked at how to do that yet, so for the moment we just go now and our program, and the user will have to run the program again. So coming back to our code in here, if they did do it correctly, we can now convert it. So we're going to store it in a variable called maxval again, and we're just going to do the integer conversion on maxval. So again, just to reiterate, it's taken the string maxval which the user put in. We now know that it contains a digital value. We put it send it to the int function as an argument. The int function returns it as an integer, and it creates a new variable with the same label, maxval, which is now an integer. So now what we can do is we can enter a loop, because remember we now want to print this information out every time. I'm going to create a generic variable called num in range. We'll start at 2. That saves all the complications of whether 1 is a prime or not. We go up to max value. Now I actually want to go to the value max val. So in my loop variable I'm going to go max val plus 1. So that means I actually get to that max val number. And at the moment I'm just going to print the number at the moment, just to check that all our code is working fine. Now remember, before we enter this loop, which is obviously going to print it all the way up, really what we ought to do is probably print out our column headings. So print number, we'll just call that num. We're obviously going to calculate the fact whether it's a prime or not, and we're going to calculate the factorial. Now I'm not going to worry about how the columns line up at this stage, but we'll see how that goes on. Now I've got these two functions down here, so I suppose I ought to use them at the moment, so I can test those as well. So when I print num here, what I'm going to do is my second column was prime, so I'm going to call the isPrime function and pass it the variable num, because that was my loop variable. And I'm also going to calculate the factorial by calling the factorial function, and that also needs the value num. Okay, so you can see in this particular case we've got the value num in here for our number, and this is our number that we're counting up in the loop. It's the same variable name down here. When we pass it into the functions, it need not be the same. Remember, when we call a function, it says here to pass in the contents of the variable num, and when it is received in here down in the function, whatever we pass in is stuck into the variable. In this case it happens to have the same name, but obviously this num is just local to this factorial function, and this num variable here is local to the isPrime function. I think I've got all my brackets right. Let's just run this. Just going to call it untitled for the moment. I'll call it temp. Got a temp one there. Okay, so it restarted, nothing happened. Why did nothing happen? I've got my main, got my factorial, got my isPrime, and the answer is, well, all I did was define the functions, obviously. What I didn't do is run anything, so I've actually got to call the main function, obviously, to make it run. Let's run the module again. Here we go. Factorial and prime number checker. Please enter max value to check. Cursor's there. So I'm just going to hit return. So that is obviously it's just a null string, and it should fail because it's not a digit. Excellent. So that failed. It chucked me out as I expected. Let's just go back and rerun the program. Put a letter in. Excellent. Didn't enter a number, so that failed again. So I'm expecting. Run it again. And this time I'll put a number in, 20. Excellent, so it seems to have gone round from 2 to 20, printed the numbers. It's run the prime function, which we haven't written yet, so it's just returned true. That's what we wrote down here in our prime function, it should return 2. And it's called the factorial function. That's obviously not worked it out at the moment, so that's returned 5. Excellent, so that's giving you the basic layout of the program, the structure of it. Clearly what you need to do now is to think about the factorial function and how you'd write that, and to think about the isPrime function and how you would write that.